Hey guys, Tarke here, and I asked the people who follow me on Twitter to ask me a bunch of PoE questions, and I'll pick my favorite questions and incorporate them into a series of videos. And this is the first of those videos. I'll leave a link to the Twitter thread down below, so feel free to contribute more questions to it for future videos. Thank you, Plane. So one, where should defense come from? This question was kind of along the lines of should more of our inherent defense come from the skill tree, skill gems, or gearing? And I think that one of the issues that we've had in the past, and GGG has noticed this themselves, and they tried to fix this with adding stuff like glancing blows to the skill tree, is a lot of our very powerful endgame defenses came through stuff like Times Jewels. And I think a lot of that stuff should be more baseline, and that's why we saw stuff like Wind Dancer, stuff like Glance Blows to the Tree. I think Divine Soul would be a great like tree-based thing. But yes, I think that generally speaking, the main core defensive things should be something that's easily obtainable on the skill tree. I wouldn't like too much of that stuff to be gated behind stuff like Times Jewels and Cluster Jewels. And I think the ideal balance would be if something like 70 to 80% of our defense just naturally occurs from the skill tree and skill gems, and then the remaining 30 to 20% comes from gear optimizations. I think having stuff like a little bit of increased fortify effect or a little bit of like physical taking as elemental damage, having a bit of that on the gear is fine, and having certain chase uniques and stuff like that is good. But I think having as much of that on the core, like just base character building blocks, would be the best thing for getting people to feel like they've got more well-rounded characters. Base movement speed. So I've actually spoken about base movement speed in Path of Exile quite a lot in the past. I think the current base movement speed in PoE is far too slow. This was before. This was many years ago before we started seeing like constant capping on stuff like Queen of the Forest. But we've had lots of metas of stack as much movement speed as possible. You get to a very high point. Eventually, GG knocks it all down. Where do we go from there? I do think increasing the base movement speed by maybe 20%, and then trimming off a lot of the random excess stuff. Like, I'm not saying that every character should be faster, but I think increasing the base by about 20% and then trimming down some of the excess movement speed that you get from like eye level 86 stuff and so on and so forth. I don't have any issue with having some of that stuff be chase, but again, it comes down to what I was saying with defenses. I feel like the majority of our movement speed should be coming kind of from just a base level, and then like you're getting that additional 30% ish. I mean an overall 30%, not a flat 30%, through gearing. I think another way they could maybe go about that is maybe having more interesting movement speed utility nodes on the skill tree. That's another way they could go for it. Because there is some decent, like, just passive, oh, here's a okayish node which gives 5% movement speed here or there. But having more interesting, more specialist movement and cooldown for movement skill nodes is something, it seems like they're trying to push a bit with the nerfs to stuff like Flame Dash, etc. And another good thing about buffing the base movement speed is just moving, like naturally walking and running in Path of Exile feels so much smoother than spamming Leap Slam and spamming stuff like Shield Charge. I would bring those like movement skills down a bit, bring the base up, and then everyone kind of wins. Next, what makes a good chase unique in my mind? So there's a few different ways you can look at it. I'm not the biggest fan of uniques that are build defining because they offer a very straightforward mechanic. I quite enjoy build defining uniques because they add something completely wild. Something like Arakali's Fang, I think, would be a good example of a build defining unique because it introduces a whole new minion type. And something which is maybe of a less interesting build defining unique in my mind would be something maybe kind of like Shavs, which is why we now have lots of different ways of doing the whole low life thing, which is, I now think Shavs is in a decent spot, but originally I was a bit like, about it. I think the main thing is you don't want just raw inherent power. You either want something special and unique in the context of something like an Arakali's Fang, or you want something where you get access to something which is previously very difficult to access. So an example I often use as something which I think would make a good trap unique, if they were to ever make more trap uniques, is it's quite difficult to get Onslaught on traps, especially with the changes to Onslaught now. So a trap-based item which had some just generically good trap stuff and then gave access to something like Onslaught, great, that is a solid chase unique. An example of a chase unique which kind of falls into that build-defining bit, which annoys me a bit, would be, for example, the incursion gloves, which are a trap unique, which they kind of solve too many things and they kind of go the other way. So it's just, they're like a no-brainer item slot. I'm not a big fan of no-brainer item slots. I'd like each slot to be more interesting. So those gloves, they're like, oh, well, they give you blood magics, they solve all your mana problems, and oh, they give you all your charge generation, and oh, they also give you loads of extra trap throwing speed, and you can only get that high trap throwing speed with those gloves, and if you don't have those gloves, well then, tough luck. That, in my mind, is a bad chase unique. A recent unique that I really enjoyed was the shield from Ultimatum. I thought that was a very fun unique, because again, it had a little bit of special, but it's mostly just that we're giving you lots of things which are normally hard to have all at the same time. I've also been quite a big fan of a lot of the like multiple corruption items we've seen, so like the Cirrus gloves, also the corruptible helmet from Ultimatum last league. Yeah, mostly just items which just package together interesting and otherwise unusual effects. Those, I think, in my mind, are what make a good chase unique. How to better separate traps and mines. Wasn't planning on making a trap video, but yes, here we go. So yeah, with the rework to mines, they feel a lot more like traps. I think a good way to really focus on their separation is putting more emphasis on cooldown traps, which is something we've kind of been seeing with like the Buster Seismic trap that changes to Lightning Spire trap. Please buff Flamethrower trap. But yeah, making the big cooldown traps feeling more impactful, and maybe having it so that the trap style is more about throwing slower but bigger, boomier style like gadgets, and the mines are more about the rapid fire stuff. I like the fact that traps can prelay. I think another way of going about it would also be introducing more unique things which don't just scale both. So, you know, you have stuff like Siphoning Trap, you have stuff like Bear Trap, you have stuff like Skitterbots. But a lot of the time when they introduce new mine things or new trap things, they make it work for both traps and mines. Just continue to introduce new interesting options that are slightly more specialist, because that's fine. Being specialist is a good thing. More room for active support gameplay. Okay, so this was the final question for today's video. So basically the question was like, do you think there's room for support gameplay which isn't just be a curse bot or just be an aura bot? And I think yes, but I think focusing on it from the point of view of, oh, we just want to make interesting support skills isn't very exciting, because most people don't play support. I think the way to focus on that is continuing to focus on skill gems that interact with other abilities, and maybe just having a league which is all about that, and that way you can, and what I mean by that would be skill something kind of like Flame Wall. So imagine if you had a league where GG's like, okay, we're just going to introduce like 10 to 15 new skills that just interact and support other playstyles. We kind of saw this with when they introduced like Void Sphere and Frost Shell and that sort of stuff. But if you introduce a bunch of skills like that, then it gives interesting options to support players, but it also gives interesting options to minion builds. It gives interesting options to anything which can fit in triggers, like Spellslinger stuff. A lot of very interesting builds can come into effect when you introduce these side options. Flame Wall, for example, opened up so many build archetypes, so imagine if we had a whole bunch of different things like that. And I quite like the idea of having like short, empowering kind of abilities, or abilities which enhance and augment others. And I think that would be quite a good way for GG to focus some of their efforts in, because I think one thing that GG often struggles with, and I think 315 was an excellent example of this, was 19 new skill gems. But then if the skill gem doesn't quite land, it's like 19 bricks and new builds. But if you have a league where it's like 19 new interesting side utility skills, well, no one's build is just purely a utility skill, right? And then even if they're not the best thing in the world, they still have their niche use, which impacts and improves on other build stuff. And those skill gems also have more value as time goes on, because, for example, if you're like, oh, this is Glacial Hammer and now this is Ice Crash, well, you could make like 8 different Glacial Hammers, but they don't really interact that well with other abilities in interesting new ways. But whenever you make a new skill like Flame Wall, not only does that add loads of interest to old builds, also any future build that could impact or synergize with it. But yes, I'm Tarke. That was my 5 Twitter questions for today. Again, if you've got any more questions for me, then check out the threads down below. Have a good day. Bye-bye. That was me dropping my list of questions. Well done.